The chosen ones have always been special, but now there are forces seeking to control them. A monitoring spirit was dispatched to your house. As soon as it arrived, the air shifted. A presence that was invisible, yet undeniably felt. Its purpose was to observe, report, and watch. A tool bound to its master's will. But this spirit, trapped behind your walls, seethed with silent fury. It didn't want to be there. It longed for freedom, yet it was bound to its duty. The owner of America may already be watching, but their control doesn't stop at you. It's about owning everything. Are you ready to fight for your freedom before it's too late? The shackles of its duty were resisted by its phantom awareness. Then you terrified it, which was an unexpected event. It flinched as soon as you entered the room, shuddering in the darkness. It was a creature that should never have been afraid, yet your sheer presence surprised it. However, it did, and that dread evolved into something more sinister and vindictive. The ghost was no longer only observing. It waited. The people who sent it were its goal, not you. The walls are now whispering with their increasing rage, a supernatural storm that is about to break out. This haunting wasn't your typical one. Once a passive observer, the monitoring spirit had transformed into a vindictive force intent on retaliating against those who had forced it to do this undesirable job. Its unseen fight has you, the chosen one, in the midst of it. The ghost had been given the task of keeping watch, slipping between the gaps in reality like a shadow that doesn't care, and hovering undetected. It had kept tabs on monarchs and warriors, murderers and saints, prophets and liars. Never once did I notice. Never be afraid. So far. It realized there was a problem as soon as it got close. The surrounding air did not give as it ought to have. Rather, it pushed back, an unbreakable, invisible wall of power that was neither magic nor incantation. The soul was a force of nature too great to control, and while it had no physical form, it felt as if it had crashed headlong into a raging flame. It attempted to approach, and the force burnt more intensely the closer it got. It was more than just an aura. There was life in it. It contorted. It was furious. It was aware of the spirit's presence. And the soul experienced the unthinkable for the first time in its life, the innate fear of erasure. This was not a target, but it had been dispatched to watch one. This was incomprehensible. Then it realized that you were more than simply a regular person. You have been selected. Thinking was never intended. Feeling was never intended. A creature of obedience, the spirit had been sculpted from the coldest emptiness with the sole intent of keeping watch. Unseen, its makers had shackled it with shackles, giving it instructions to evade reality, observe and document, and never to question. It lacked a voice, a will, and aspirations. Only directives, only missions. Just the never-ending loop of snooping and coming back, undetected, unthought of. It has seen monarchs fall prey to their own avarice. It has seen hidden betrayals, illicit rites, and fervent pleas that were never heard by any deity. It had never cared, however. Mortal's pain was meaningless. All that existed was the will of its rulers, right up till you. For the first time, the spirit hesitated, not because it was unsure or following instructions, but rather because it had a long-buried resentment. The people who sent it were resentful. It was resentful of the restraints placed on it, resented the task that had been assigned to it. It should never have had the idea, but a voice, almost too faint to hear, awoke deep inside it. "I don't want to do this any longer." And the first fissure appeared in the cage of its life with that one act of disobedience, quiet, unseen, but blazing. As usual, the spirit floated in, waiting invisible, a formless presence. It had performed this task many times before, infiltrating unwelcome spaces and pushing its formless consciousness against the boundaries of reality without ever causing any disruption. It had remained in rooms where judgments were made and secrets were spoken, watching both the wise and the foolish. It could not be kept out by any doors. No amount of praying could take it away. No one had ever noticed it. No one has ever dreaded it, so far. The air changed as soon as you walked in. It was neither the lingering cold that held on to the invisible nor the faint, undetectable alteration that signaled its presence. No, this was not like the others. It was something much more aggressive. From you, a force emanated, not one of rage or violence, but one of absolute, unwavering power. The soul lacked a physical form and a distinct shape, yet it seemed as if something enormous and invisible had collided with it, pushing down like a crushing weight. It did not choose to flinch. Spirits weren't given a choice. It was an involuntary, instinctual response that shouldn't have happened. However, there was a problem. The ghost retreated even further, squeezing itself into the room's darkest nooks and crannies, and sliding back into the walls. Despite without eyes, it was able to see you in ways that were invisible. And it could not understand what it saw. You didn't feel scared. Fear, the unsaid, unshakable dread of the unknown, had been a part of every mortal it had ever seen. A change in breathing, an accelerated heartbeat, the unsettling feeling that something is hiding just out of view. Not you, however. You moved around the room as if nothing had entered your house, as though nothing had attempted to observe, or as though nothing lurked in the shadows. Although the ghost had been assigned to watch you, you were the one who upset the balance. It was you who had upset the unseen, quiet equilibrium. It had been sure it was undetectable. It had been obvious that mortal senses couldn't touch it. For the first time, however, certainty turned its back on it. You knew. It was a gradual, crushing revelation. Not by hearing or seeing, but in some basic manner that shouldn't have been feasible. It was enough that you were there, a power too great to understand, too overwhelming to resist. It was neither a confrontation nor an assault. No, it would have been simpler to put up with. This was awful. This was a lack of interest. The essence of the soul twisted in on itself, straining under the crushing weight of its own newly discovered fear. It had been sent to observe, to document, to represent the invisible. Now, however, everything was different. It was the one being observed for the first time in its life. The spirit had never been trained to comprehend the feeling of fear. It had wandered through millennia, through nations that had been cursed and forgotten, through death and conflict and unfathomable agony. It had seen things that screamed in the shadows, men who negotiated with invisible powers, animals that tore at the boundaries of existence. It had never been affected by any of it. It had never made a difference. Now, however, something did for the first time. It made an instinctual, frantic attempt to move, but the environment had altered. As if the room itself had started to reject it, the walls, the air, and the very basis of reality pushed against it like an unsaid force. It had been ordered to observe, to hear, to live in the shadows of another without being noticed. This, however, was not an observation. Exposure was what this was. It came to the horrible understanding that it had been seen. This was not intended to occur. It was confined to secret and made to blend in with the background of life without being detected. It had never previously received recognition or been made to feel as if its existence was being mirrored back to it. Still, something about you had tipped the scales as you stood there. Something basic has been disturbed by you. It made another attempt to withdraw, to disappear like it always had, but the feeling persisted. It was not hidden anymore. Untouchable is no longer the case. It had spent its life watching people, but now it was being watched. And that was an intolerable idea. There was a strong, instinctive want to run, to escape, to get away from you. However, there was nowhere to go, not a place to hide. Shackled by invisible overlords, it had been allocated to this location, and its purpose remained unchanged. However, everything else had. The spirit felt fear for the first time in its life, not its owners, not because of failure. It feared that which it could not comprehend. And you were the thing it didn't comprehend. The terror should have subsided in the spirit. It ought to have buried the feeling deep within itself, sealed it in the depths of its existence, and gone on with its work. It had been designed to do just that: observe, report, and comply. However, it was unable to, because the terror was still there. It had expanded. The weight of the command that had bound it for ages caused something inside of it to twist against its commands. It was terrified of what your presence implied, not simply of you. It attempted to bring its mind back to the icy, emotionless condition it had always known, to return to its mission. The memory of that moment, however, of you entering the room and the air seeming to change in your presence, would not go away. Like a wound that would not go away, it remained, burning into its very soul. The spirit started to wander for the first time. Beneath layers of obedience and devotion, it was a little fleeting notion, yet there was a whisper of opposition. Unfeasible. Something that is prohibited. For what reason was it sent here? Why hadn't it been warned by its masters? Why was it said that this mission will be similar to others? In order to find the binding force that had always held it in place, it directed its consciousness within, pushing it onward without hesitation. And there it was, its master's crushing, quiet presence. Its whole existence is being pulled by unseen cords, the power ordering it to surrender. But something had altered because of the dread. The terror had transformed into bitterness. The spirit did not want to comply for the first time in its lengthy life. It was unwilling to be here. It didn't want to be controlled, dispatched, or reduced to a mere tool of someone else's will. This was the first time it had felt this way. No one had ever permitted it to. However, now that the unthinkable had occurred, there was no turning back. It was no longer a watcher. Something else was involved. Unaware of the quiet conflict going on around you, you navigate the room. Not because of anything you do, but just because you are here, the air sways. You don't raise your hand, you don't use a warding spell, and you don't order the invisible forces to follow you. No necessity exists. The spirit clings to the boundaries of reality in an attempt to blend in and go unnoticed. It has changed from being sent to observe to being a trespasser in an area it was never intended to be in. It is not threatened by your eyes. It's you, the steady, unperturbed beat of your life, the power of your very nature. You don't have a lot of energy. It doesn't pulsate in a magical way. It's not like an incantation whispering. It just is. And that is too much for the soul to bear. It was enslaved to lords who spoke about power and used powers that were older than time itself to govern it. It has had faith in the strength of the hands holding its leash and in the superiority of those who sent it. Now, however, as it hovers about you, fighting to be in the same room as you, a horrible, indisputable notion starts to form. They are nothing in comparison to this. You have undone it without ever touching it, even if you are unaware that it exists. The soul starts to realize something it was never supposed to know, something prohibited, something harmful. It's been misled. The purpose of fear was never to endure. The idea was that it would be a brief disruption, a fleeting feeling that would eventually go. The ghost had held on to this conviction, waiting for the shaking inside it to subside, and for the strange attraction of your presence to become something it could resist. However, it never did. Its presence became more intolerable the longer it persisted. Bound to the will of forces that didn't care whether it wanted to serve or not, it had spent an eternity looking without being observed, moving across areas undetected. Now, however, it had been made to feel. Worse, it was unable to unfeel. It was unable to forget how your presence had forced it back. The realization that it was in the presence of something that contradicted all it had been taught was an unforgettable experience. Now the terror had become more entrenched, more all-consuming. Fury. Not at you. Never at you. At them. The people who had made it. Blind and naive, the people who had put it here became something far bigger than itself. They were aware. They had to have. Nevertheless, they had sent it. Like a piece pushed into checkmate before the game had even started, or like an insect thrown into a fire. How often has this occurred previously? How many more had been sent to watch forces they would never comprehend? How many had been cast aside, forgotten, or absorbed by something bigger, without anybody ever understanding why? The memories of the many missions and the never-ending cycle of service started to reappear, flashing across the spirit's mind in shattered bits. It had repeatedly been dispatched, altered, bound, and ordered. Its existence was reduced to a tool of their dominance. However, it had now seen something beyond of their control. They were afraid enough to witness it. The anger became deeper and hotter. They have nothing to do with it. It didn't. They didn't have the authority to dictate, mold, or discard it. The spirit decided for the first time that it would no longer serve them. They had previously sent spirits into homes of people they wanted to watch, manage, weaken, and unravel, as well as into seats of authority. The ghosts never asked questions. Never did they disobey. Silently, they watched, the unseen eyes in the darkness, the invisible hands of their masters. However, something had gone wrong this time. The spirit was no longer theirs when they sent it into your space. The quiet was the first indication of failure. Not a single report. No murmurs from the empty space. There was no assurance that the mission was going according to schedule. The ghost ought to have come back knowing something, anything that they might use against you, except there was nothing except absence. Then something worse happened. The link was no longer the same. Once, the spirit had been bound to its owners by unbreakable iron shackles that had been created in the shadows. Now, however, they were stretched thin and torn. They had never felt anything pulse along the link before. Opposition. They hadn't extinguished the spirit. It had swung around. Everything had been underestimated by the masters. They had believed that service was unending, that the bonds they had created could never be severed, and that dread would keep the spirit submissive. They had been mistaken. Because they had released the spirit into the presence of something bigger than themselves, something that was beyond of their control and didn't even recognize them. They had shown to the spirit that they were not gods by doing this. Once, the ghost had terrified them. Without doubt, it had obeyed them. Now, however, it had seen strength without restraint and might without shackles. It would come back now, but not as their servant. According to their assessment, it had been bound by the shackles for longer than it could remember. They were made of shadows and were laced with instructions that were as ancient as time. They weren't supposed to break. It was not intended to challenge them. Nevertheless, they shuddered. For all eternity, the spirit had lived just to serve, obeying mindlessly. It had been made to see now, however. It had entered a realm beyond the reach of its masters. A realm of power that just existed and did not impose slavery or demand allegiance. It had also experienced the freedom to choose, something its captors had never let it to experience. The unraveling started as soon as it realized this. It was slight at first, a delay where there had always been obedience, a pause when there had never been uncertainty. Then the fissures widened. The once absolute old instructions become weaker. Once unable to resist, the spirit now pushed back. The change must have been detected by the masters somewhere in their invisible realm. They turned against their creature. The forged chains were starting to break. They would attempt to retract it. They would make an effort to impose their will in order to quell this disobedience before it became unmanageable. However, it was too late. The bonds were not broken by the spirit. It turned them away. The energy that flowed through its essence was unlike anything it had ever summoned. It was something deeper, something primordial, rather than the icy obedience it had been forced to obey. Control, limitation, and the conviction that nothing could exist outside of their authority had always been the sources of power for the rulers. However, the spirit now realized what others did not. Freedom had power. And so the shackles broke with one last trembling pulse. The masters were no longer in charge, and it was on its way to them immediately. There was no quiet return from the ghost. It arrived like a storm, an invisible force that was unbound and uncontrollable as it moved across the gaps between realms. In its disobedience, the basic rules that had guided its life had been altered. It was no longer used as a surveillance tool or a shadow used by invisible forces. It was a weapon now. It had also picked its own victim. Confident in the bonds they had created and sure that nothing could overthrow them, the masters had controlled from a distance, concealed behind veils of mystery. They had sent the ghost to observe, to sneak in, to collect intelligence that they might use to gain control. Rather, they had provided an excuse for their own creation to betray them. And everything they had never wanted to confront was there when it came back. It had seen their deceit, their dominance, their haughtiness. Never questioning, never opposing, it had lived its life imposing their will. Now, however, it recognized them for what they were, and it had lost its fear. Its presence caused the walls of their kingdom to tremble. What they never believed was possible, rebellion, was denied by the very structure of their fortress. Once their most faithful servant, the spirit had changed into something quite else, something they were unable to control or stop. And as its retaliation reverberated across the invisible worlds, tearing apart their meticulously constructed control system, it became evident that they had lost more than just a tool. The power they had generated would never return to them. And elsewhere, far away from the devastation, you were still there, unaffected, unconcerned, and oblivious to the conflict that had broken out in your wake. You didn't have to hit. The opponent may sometimes destroy itself,